Okay, we are approaching 5 past the hour. So I thought we would get started with the session, even as people continue to make their way in. It's nice to see you all. For those of you who are speaking Spanish, a normal reminder that we have interpretation available to us through our lovely interpreters, Ingrid and Mariana, on the interpretation button in a Spanish channel if you prefer to speak and listen in Spanish. My name is David Adler. I've been away from our sessions for a few weeks. It's great to be back, and an even more special privilege to be introducing our guest lecturer for this week, Professor Thea Riofrancos, who is going to help us make sense of perhaps the thorniest question of contemporary international political economy, in particular from the perspective of from progressive forces, which is, of course, the question of extraction, the flows and the institutions that determine access to, enjoyment of, or death by natural resource extraction, and the transition that we are witnessing today between not just the direction and the destination of those flows of extraction, but also the types and the resources being extracted. These are obviously huge questions that are not just determinative for our pocketbooks and for our political systems, but also for the future of humanity. So, Thea, you've bitten off just as much as we can chew in the course of an hour. As usual, I encourage all of you to think of questions, clarifications that you might want to put to Thea in the course of the lecture and put them in the chat. And at the end of the formal presentation, I'll be engaging in conversation with Thea on the basis of those questions for a kind of rich Q&A of about 15 or 20 minutes. But for now, I wanted to pass it over to Thea for her presentation. Thea is a professor at Providence College and the author of in numerous articles and essays and indeed books. I would say most importantly, a book called Resource Radicals, which is a really, I would say, quintessential dive into these thorny questions and how they both unite and divide left and progressive and indigenous forces through questions of extraction. So I've come to love Thea's work, but also to trust her as a very insightful and generous and patient intellectual as we needle through these epically confusing and challenging questions. So Thea, I'll pass it over to you, and I'll be monitoring the chat to gather questions for the Q&A session. But I wanted to thank you again for making time this weekend and preparing such an amazing presentation for us all to enjoy. So over to you, Thea. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. I'm blushing, but also intimidated by the introduction. So we'll see how far I get. And I will say that it's absolutely right that I find this a wrenching and thorny topic, both in terms of South relations and inequality, also in terms of the urgency of climate change and the new ways that that's reconfiguring extractive frontiers. And lastly, and this is just again as a preface, the challenge of responding to all of that for the left, I think, kind of surfaces some of the most difficult strategic dilemmas and dilemmas of internationalism and how we actually ally across borders towards a kind of more global vision. So with that, give me a moment to do the screen share operation and we will get started. Okay. This lecture I've entitled Extraction, which is going to be the key concept that we're learning about today. Under that umbrella, we'll learn about a few more key concepts. We'll also pay attention to the ways that both within capitalism, but also between forces of capital and the state, there are a number of intensifying contradictions related to the extraction of raw materials. but someone who is annoyingly maybe not an optimist, but tries to stay attuned to political possibilities that might be better than the status quo. I'll also get into some ways in which extraction is changing and or might be changed for the better, especially in the global south, but not exclusively. So with that, I'm just going to give you a bit of an outline of where we're going today. I'll adjust the time as we move forward to stay on time, but this is at least my plan. So just an overview. I won't read out loud every word here because I don't think that's that helpful, but just to give you a sense of like the range of topics we might cover, but also what might not be there in case, you have interest that I'm not directly addressing, and maybe we'll get to talk about those in the Q&A. So I want to start with some basic definitions, but kind of quickly, we're going to see that things are not so basic. But I do think it helps to kind of level the playing field. I never like to assume background knowledge. But even for those of you that are quite knowledgeable, which I imagine many of you are, we might be working out of different political traditions and so I just am going to provide some grounding so that we're more or less on the same page by what I mean by extraction, and maybe more importantly, what we might mean by extractivism. When we think about the word extraction, we might make a simple observation, which is that all human societies rely on nature. We're going to complicate that in a moment, but that basic fact is important. And I'll circle back to it a couple times later in this presentation. But a more fancy way to refer to extraction would be social metabolism. And I actually take that from people who are theorists coming out of the global south, coming out of Latin America, who have really identified these processes of how human societies organize their relationship with nature, particularly with regards to the use of energy and the use of materials, right? And so social metabolism is something every society engages in short form. But we do see some interesting observations just staying at this level of analysis. One is that the total use of materials, and by this, it refers to biomass. A lot of that is agriculture, but not exclusively. There's also biomass energy sources. But regardless, biomass, fossil fuels, metals, and non-metallic minerals, that's what we are looking at when we look at, what's being extracted. When we take a kind of 70-year time frame, we see that there's been an enormous increase in how many materials are extracted from the earth and the volume of extraction, from 30 billion tons in 1950, that is during the post-war boom, so a moment of growth, but to the present, we have 100 billion tons, right? There's lots of reasons for increase. We could talk about simple like growing population, but it's really not just about population, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so we understand what extraction is. It involves taking kind of materials or energy from nature. We see that that's increased quite rapidly over the past 70 years. We also are, can with concern kind of observe that this level of extraction is the cause of what the global resources outlook by the United Nations calls the triple planetary crisis, which is climate change, obviously very related to the extraction of fossil fuels, but also to other land use and deforestation that makes that disturbs the atmospheric system. We obviously have nature and biodiversity loss. When we're extracting this many materials, nature is going to suffer. And then we have the waste of all of this, right? So when you extract metal from the earth, you don't extract it in its refined form. You extract a lot of rock, most of that rock is waste, and then a small percentage is the valuable metal, right? So it contributes to this overall waste that we have in our planetary system. The other thing that I think we should note at the outset is that extraction is extremely unequal. That's going to be like a running theme of this. And a simple but very, I think, important way to think about that inequality is that high-income countries use 6 times more materials per capita, so that's weighted by population, than low-income countries, and are not unrelatedly responsible for 10 times more climate impacts and these other impacts as well. So we see immediately that there's an unequal use of resources, but there's more inequality than that. There's kind of different dimensions of inequality. And so I think this immediately suggests that there's a political economy of extraction, right? David used that term at the beginning. It's not just like all societies extract and we're all kind of doing the same thing. Some societies on Earth extract more than others, but there's also a relationship between where extraction takes place, where it's consumed, and the kind of political economic factors that structure that. And so a more systemic or systematic way of thinking about resource extraction is as a system that relates very closely to capitalism called extractivism. And I take this term directly from Latin American comrades and intellectuals who were really the first to coin this idea that there's a systematic quality to the way that extraction becomes economically and politically and territorially ingrained, and into its, and as well as its developmental impacts. So what is extractivism, or what does it add to that simpler definition of extraction that I offered earlier? So one is its scale. When we look at extraction under capitalism, and again, extractivism is kind of just the form that extraction takes under the longue durée of global capitalism, right? So when we look at that longue durée, we see that what one noteworthy feature is that the scale is very large. The scale of mining projects, of fossil fuels, of agriculture, all increases quite a bit as capitalism develops, right? Of course, ancient societies, indigenous societies use metals for decoration, for spiritual purposes, for architecture. It's not that, you know, capitalist society is the first to use metals, but the scale of it is fundamentally distinct. And so that's important. The other, and this is now we're kind of situating ourselves in the global South contexts, it's export oriented, right? So it's a large scale operation that's oriented externally to be shipped across borders. So whether it's copper or oil or cotton or soy, the idea is you have a large scale operation and it's leaving the country. We also can see that the global commodity markets, the global markets for these raw materials are quite volatile. That has immediate impacts on the developmental trajectories of global South countries that tend to economically rely on these raw materials. So if the copper price dramatically increases, you're in a great place. If it crashes, you know, you have a fiscal problem. So that's another feature of extractivism, is this volatility. Related is the fact that in the countries that export the materials, though this is starting to change, which is a good thing, and I'll come back to that later, but historically, there's been very little processing or value-added economic activity or downstream. That means like looking at the supply chain downstream from the mine or the farm. There's very little happening. It's just kind of exported in its raw form, which contributes to the boom and bust and the volatility, because you're very reliant on something that is priced by global markets rather than by manufactured goods that are a bit more stable in their pricing. Another couple things, and this is going to point us towards like the political dynamics and the social dynamics of extraction, of extractivism, is that it's territorially expansive. You can look with even satellite imagery and see how mines expand in their individual scale, how mining regions of the world, the mines tend to proliferate, how you have these really large extractive frontiers. Sometimes the project might take years to develop, but in the meantime, the company has territorial control of the land, right? So there's a territorialized dynamic that contributes to the patterns of conflict, which often tend to start locally, but not exclusively, meaning that especially with environmental and social conflict, the first to bear the brunt of that is the local community, but we'll come back to that. And the last is that at the nation state level, but also in other supranational organs, we could even look at the IMF or the World Bank or other things, but including at the domestic state level in global South countries that economically rely on these resources, there's a lot of political and ideological support, sometimes crossing the ideological spectrum in interesting ways, for the continuity of extraction. So it becomes a very systemic operation, hence extractivismo or extractivism to denote its systematicity, and difficult to contest, but not impossible. So, you know, another thing contributing to the difficulty of contesting it, but also the fact that it has been so long a site of conflict, is the very unequal, oftentimes violent, and specifically colonial origins of the system of extraction that we have today. This is one of like a million examples I could show you, which is just an engraving from the mid-18th century of the silver mines of Potosi, which across 250 years or so of Spanish imperial control supplied 20% of the world's silver and supplied endless revenues for the Spanish crown to engage in all sorts of wars in Europe, to compete with other empires, to just make fancy clothing for, you know, Spanish imperial agents, right? Like all sorts of benefits that they got from it. But what was happening was resources were being drained at a alarming, accelerating rate from what we now call Bolivia. Then I believe it was called Upper Peru. There was coerced labor and forms of enslaved labor in the mines. There was a whole system of territorial, political, and economic domination that kind of set the scene for what extraction would look like for the next hundreds of years, right? Again, this is the 18th century. And unfortunately, a lot of the basic dynamics still apply today, with some important exceptions. Again, we will get into the present soon, but this is the historical origins of extractivismo. So, another way to look at historic origins is not specific examples, but kind of thinking structurally about the planetary economic system and how resource extraction fits into it, and also how resource extraction actually reveals underlying relationships, right? So this is, for many of you, this will be basic, duh, you've learned these, some of it might be new, but the idea that there is a world system, meaning that there is an interconnected grid of economic activity buttressed by political states at the national and supranational level, right? So that's what we mean by the world system. But right away, I want to note that just because it's interconnected doesn't mean it's equal, right? Because the other key facet of the world system is a fundamental inequality between the positions that different states occupy. And I borrow from Wallerstein, who in turn borrowed from Latin American scholars in the 60s and 70s to talk about core, periphery, and semi-periphery. I'll put semi-periphery aside for now, even though it's actually quite interesting, but a little less germane. I'm happy to answer questions about it in the Q&A. Core and periphery is the more basic kind of two categories. It's sort of thinking like capitalist class and working class, right? It's a way to simplify, but in analytically revealing ways, the kind of social structure at stake. And what core or periphery are not like a country is always a core or a country is always a periphery. What they are positions in the system that countries rotate in and out of, but due to various mechanisms that reproduce the global system, countries often stay put for a long time. Like the same countries that were colonized in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century tend to stay in the core, maybe not forever. We have the Chinas, we have the Brazils, right? There are countries that move in and out, right? Or we have former cores like Spain, and maybe we'd say they've kind of dropped from their powerful position, right? So the countries move around, the positions stay the same. And what defines being in the periphery is that your whole economic outlook is oriented towards the needs of the core, right? That's what Cardoso called the Brazilian, he became a president later, but before then he was a more radical dependency theorist. So Cardoso called the situation of dependency. So that's the second bullet point. What that means is that your economic development or underdevelopment, more accurately in these cases, is defined by the needs of greater powers, by the core states, the powerful states that tend to be industrialized, tend to have powerful militaries, tend to have powerful political apparatuses. Those states want the raw materials to develop their industries. And if you are on the periphery side of the global system, you are providers of those. You net export and all the resources are drained away from you, right? And what's important to note is that that is unequal. We often hear from like mainstream economics, oh, some countries specialize in copper and other countries specialize in semiconductors. It's just comparative advantage, right? But it actually, I mean, there's a lot of problems with just that statement that we could get into. But the more fundamental point is it's not equal to be an exporter of copper and an importer of semiconductors, because it's always the case that the raw materials have less value added and therefore sell more cheaply than the industrialized final products that they are inputs for. That can even be exacerbated, as Raul Prebisch, the Argentinian economist who was very important in developing some of these ideas, he also said that over time, the terms of trade can get worse. So it's not a stable inequality, it's actually a worsening inequality. Then people have investigated, is that true? Does it always get worse? We can get into that. But point being, the exchange is unequal, and that has economic dimensions, so that the global north, the periphery, captures the monetary benefits of trade, and it has ecological dimensions in terms of resource drain and who pays the ecological cost. It also generates in the global south these what are called enclave economies. I also take this from Cardoso and Filetto, who look where it's like a sector that's an oil sector or copper or cotton, and it's totally divorced from the rest of the economy. It doesn't generate any national development. All it does is export the resource abroad and import, it gets the revenues in exchange, but the revenues don't make up for all of the loss in resources. So that's dependency theory, and that's a lens that we're going to use a lot today. So I'll pick up my pace a little bit. I just wanted to be sure that we understood the key terms, because it's better to skip later things than the basics, the fundamentals that you all came here for. So I think probably the best example or not the best, because you could do the same for Africa and South Asia. So let me not say it that way, but a very clear example of how dependency theories analysis kind of unfolds is Latin America. And it's not really an accident, because as I'll note in a moment, Latin America was actually a place where a lot of dependency theory got articulated, right? With very important contributions from scholars, again, in South Asia and Africa as well. So I don't want to downplay those regions, but for reasons that will become clear momentarily, Latin America is a place where there was some early development of these theories. And that's, one reason for that is Latin America has for hundreds of years, I showed you that slide from Potosi, for over 500 years has been a source of really important raw materials for the global economy and for the core economies that imported and industrialized those materials. And that gap between imports and exports just grows, right? Latin America more and more exports enormous volumes of raw materials to the global economy, right? And so that's what these charts are showing us. And I want to just note that this is going to be the case for the near or proximate future, and we'll circle back to this at the very end. But Latin America is poised to provide a lot of the mined materials needed for the energy transition, right? So this chart is actually showing that Latin America, I mean, it's kind of cast positively here, like has the most to gain from trade, but we can just see the flip side of that, where a lot of the resources for the global green energy transition are coming from Latin America. And so that unequal exchange, economic and ecological, persists. But, what I want to always emphasize, is that it's not just an economic structure with no politics or no contestation. The origins of extractivism in these colonial relationships has also been always one of struggle, of conflict, of class conflict, of interstate conflict, etc. And Latin America is a really good place to sort of understand these conflicts, because it has a unique aspect to it as a peripheral region of the world system. And that's the first bullet point here. Latin America was the first entire region, not talking at the country scale or subnational scale, but the first entire region of the world economy or the world system that gained independence from European powers, because it gained independence for the most part, with some exceptions, in the early 19th century. That's before a lot of the rest of the global South was colonized, right? So Latin America is colonized early and it gains independence early, right? It took a while to gain independence, but by the early 19th century, that was the case. So that gives them political sovereignty, right? Political independence from their former colonial masters, so to speak, Spain and Brazil. But right away, like, we can see that what doesn't change is economic dependency, right? So Latin America was a region that since the early 19th century, and we could even say until the present, to be a little simplistic, Latin America enjoys political independence, but not economic independence, right? And that disjuncture or that tension gives rise to actually a lot of interesting intellectual and political contributions, as well as public policy experiments, that Latin America is, again, one of the first places of what we call the global South to kind of make some of these moves because of its political independence. So an example of that is that we have the first resource nationalizations outside of the Soviet Union, and some of the first in the world, even including the Soviet Union, in Latin America. So the first time that that government said, we're going to expropriate these resources, we're going to take them back under our control, we're going to kick out Standard Oil or Anaconda Copper or whatever it is, those first came in Latin America. And Argentina is the very first, according to the historical record. Bolivia and Mexico follow. There's a bunch more in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that I'm not listing. I just want to show the first one so we get how early this happened. So this is primarily oil and minerals, but later on we get nationalizations in other resources too. So we also see a lot of the intellectual contributions. I won't belabor that because I've already mentioned and tried to cite my sources, but we get a lot of the first theorizing of the kind of combination of political independence and economic dependency by Latin American scholars, who quickly become very immersed in broader third world, then called third world networks of scholars and activists and government leaders in Africa, in Middle East, in Asia, right? And so this gets globalized, but a lot of the important contributions start in Latin America. Those Latin American thinkers and economists were very involved in UN institutions like CEPAL or ECLAC or UNICTAD, right, that dealt with issues of development, of trade, of regional integration, et cetera. Venezuela played a very key role in establishing OPEC and particularly in lending it a more anti-imperial flavor in its early years. And you also, it wasn't just an elite story. You also had a lot of militancy on the part of oil and mine workers that pushed elites to embrace resource nationalism, to embrace public ownership. Of course, the workers wanted more than that. They wanted a revolution. They wanted worker ownership and management. Sometimes there were tensions there, things we can discuss later, but just to give you a sense. But just as Latin America was a kind of case study of these more radical experiments in the mid 20th century, it not unrelatedly then became a laboratory for reaction, right? For a place where neoliberal policies, deregulation, privatization, low taxes, sometimes no taxes or no royalties, and all of this created an influx of foreign mining and also oil. But I'm focusing, I meant to say this, a little more on mining today in my presentation, but we can speak to other things in the Q&A. So what you have is a kind of dismantling of this mid 20th century era of more state control. You have less state control, or maybe better put, more state policy oriented towards attracting foreign investors, with really catastrophic impacts on development, on the fiscal base as you're lowering tax rates and royalty rates, but also on social and environmental outcomes locally, because you had very little regulation of all of this. The next couple of things to point out, and this concludes our little case study of Latin America, is that, it doesn't end with neoliberalism. Though some countries remained under a neoliberal governance model and remain so today, there was a huge revolution almost that swept the continent, that I'm sure you've touched on in other prior progressive international lectures, or you're probably aware of, but the pink tide. At the height of the pink tide in 2010, 2/3 of Latin American residents lived in lived under center left to radical left governments, right? So it was a huge sea change away from neoliberalism. Again, not every country, but some of the biggest countries, whether we're looking at Brazil, Chile, Argentina, right? Or not Chile at the time. Chile is like in the new pink tide, sorry, or Bachelet, depending how we want to classify her. Anyway, but Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, like countries with large economies with a very important large extractive sectors too, were now under left-wing government. And what does that mean? They started to reverse some of the neoliberalism, but not all of it. Like, it's very hard to undo these economic structures, especially from a counter-hegemonic position, right? And so maybe they didn't do as much outright nationalization and the expropriation meaning of that term, but they did toughen up a lot in negotiating with foreign firms. They sometimes force the foreign firm to give half of the ownership to the state. So not full expropriation, but not insignificant. They forced the companies, the mining and oil companies, to renegotiate the contracts so that the state got more. They therefore increased a lot of the revenues from resources, and this was during a commodity boom, so that also helped a lot. And then they used the resources to fund social spending that had all been under austerity from the neoliberal era. So there was a lot of built up social need that they used these resources to fund. So we can see now at a couple of junctures, I'm just going to pause briefly, like how the left interacts with extraction. There's the kind of classical left position of nationalization and expropriation and sort of developmentalism. There's then this newer left that is operating more in a global neoliberal context and can't totally escape from that, but is doing its best to kind of assert more state control and get more social benefit out of these sectors. And then we have a kind of third type of left, which is anti-extractivism, which is a critique of extractivism that I've already mentioned, but it's in the form of movements, right? So there's the intellectual critique, which actually oftentimes comes from the movements, but there's also the political activity. And what we see across Latin America, and the mining CEOs say this, the IMF says that, like mainstream people say this, and scholars and, all sorts of people observe the same thing, which is that Latin America is the place where you get the most resistance to resource extraction. I think that's not unrelated to that longer history, that tension between political sovereignty and economic independence, but also the territorial expansiveness of extraction. I showed you those slides of how much mining and agriculture and all this takes place in Latin America. So there's a lot of affected territory and communities in the region, right? And that births movements. Not always, not every community resists extraction or resists in the same way, but we get some kind of similar outcomes where communities that experience exclusion from decision making, meaning like if the mining company just comes in and the government supports them and they start building a large scale mine and they never ask the community what they think, they don't respect the rights to consultation or consent, which we'll come to a little later. They don't respect these rights. They just run, roughshod over everything. Those tend to get resistance from communities. No one likes like a massive land use change, the destruction of sacred land, the destruction of farming, of agriculture, of like livelihoods, of your rivers, of water sources. No one likes that. And then on top of that, to be excluded, right? And so that is a volatile combination that leads to conflict and protests, the intense environmental impacts and the ways that communities are mistreated by corporations and governments. And the mistreatment is not just being excluded from the table of decision making, though that's big and important. It's even more concrete and tragic than that, which is that a lot of people get injured or die in these conflicts at the hands of state repressive forces or privatized security forces. And in fact, Latin America is the most dangerous world region to try to defend your land, environment, or water from extraction. That's from Global Witness's reports. Every year, it's the same. Latin America is one of the worst. Some countries like Colombia, and I don't want to, I mean, Petro has been trying to reverse this, right? But Colombia has a long history of this violence and extraction, so there are certain countries that even stand out here, Brazil as well. Ditto, Lula is trying to change this, but there's a long history behind it, right? So we have some countries that stand out, and Latin America stands out as a place where it's very risky to be a water, land, or environmental defender. But I want to also say that that's not just like, these are not just passive victims. Like there's conflict. People are fighting these David and Goliath battles, and they run risks doing so. And that's the kind of political contestation at the extractive frontier. So my sort of final section is what's happening now. And I've already alluded to it, but I want to now just lay out a little more clearly. And I might go more quickly through this part because I really want to leave at least 15 minutes for Q&A. So there'll be a lot of questions you can ask me or stuff that I'm skipping that you're welcome to ask me to go back to. But I want to make sure that we get to the present. So what's happening right now? We're in an energy transition. I even hesitate to call it that because actually we see oil and gas expanding very rapidly at the same time that we see renewable energy expanding rapidly. So some people say this is an energy addition, not a transition. And that's important because we have multiple, what I call extractive regimes simultaneously, which is putting a lot of pressure on planetary systems, on communities, on governments, right, to regulate it all. We have new resources that are needed for the new energy technologies and other advanced technologies. And we also have the continued expansion of fossil capitalism. And those are side by side and sometimes the same country. We can go to Argentina and its gas sector alongside its lithium sector, right? The same country is actually participating in both of these regimes of extraction to deleterious effects, again, on their territory, their sovereignty, their economic independence, et cetera, right? So it's a complex mix of a lot of extraction happening simultaneously, with the hope that if we can ever just stop extracting fossil fuels, we would eliminate a lot of the extractive pressure on Earth, but not all of it. So that's where we are at now. And let's look at this materially. And again, back to our world system ideas. Because it continues to be the case, not just that we're extracting a lot of materials, billions of tons of materials, but also that it's pretty unequally structured with some interesting changes, but a lot of continuities. For someone who's never seen these kind of resource flow graphs, this might, just be incomprehensible. But what it's showing you is the difference between who produces the resource, like where it's extracted or harvested, and then who consumes it, and showing you the balance of those. And so just to be very just clear here, and each of these are types of countries: high income, upper middle income. China gets its own category because, as we'll see, it's a kind of tricky case. Lower middle income, I don't remember what IND stands for, sorry, and low income. So we see that from the get in the purple, high income countries, and this is all the most recent data, right? This is not from the colonial period, right? This is from the 21st century recently. High income countries produce fewer resources than they consume. In other words, they are net consumers of resources. That resource drain happens from elsewhere in the world. They import resources from beyond their borders. They get to live beyond their means, right? Whereas, if we look at lower middle income countries, the thin blue, they produce more resources than they consume. That's the fundamental inequality of extraction, is that the places where the extraction tends to take place are not the places that benefit from the extraction, right? And vice versa. I said that China is an interesting case. As we can see right away, the two numbers with China's production and consumption are very close. It has in gigatons 30 gigatons of annual raw material production and 29 of consumption. Some of that is them consuming their domestic stuff. Some of it is they export some, but they also import. But they're not in as unequal a position as the rest of the global South. And I want to just note one interesting thing about China, because I always think it's an interesting economy to track, and it's really shifting the world system in certain ways, or it's shifting its position in the world system. We can actually see that on some dimensions. So the second graph there, that is about land. If you look at the y-axis kind of part, embodied land, China is actually now a net importer of what's called embodied land. This means that China is importing agricultural goods, and we look at the land embodied in those goods, the land that was required to harvest them. And it's actually more in a global north category with land, meaning it is a net recipient, a net beneficiary of embodied land, but it's still a net exporter of like everything else, raw material, energy, embodied labor, et cetera. So China's like partially global South, but kind of shifting into maybe a semi-peripheral or maybe core position in the world economy. So I won't belabor this more. I'm going to just go on to just a couple more final points here, which is that, as I already mentioned, the new green energy economy requires a lot of resource use. That's specifically mining. It needs a lot of copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earths. A lot of those right now are concentrated in the global South, though not exclusively. And so we have a kind of unfortunate reproduction of the system of global inequality in extraction and resource use happening under the kind of banner of the energy transition, which raises a lot of challenging dilemmas for climate advocates, for internationalists, for all of us, right? How do we grapple with the fact that the energy transition is mining intensive, and that is replicating patterns of unequal economic and unequal ecological exchange in the global South? But it's not just replicating patterns, right? And here's where I'm going to try to be a little bit more nuanced in my final minutes of this, which is that there are changes happening, but the changes have not fundamentally or structurally transformed the global economy, but there are interesting changes at the margins, we might say. Not that they're marginal phenomena, but they're making marginal changes in how resources are extracted and where they're extracted and who benefits from them, right? And I'm using this term that I borrow from Thea Roberts and other scholars of the global system called geoeconomics, which is what it sounds like. Instead of geopolitics, it's geoeconomics. And what that means is that, as you all know, I'm sure, we're in an era where economic policy, especially related to the energy transition and supply chains for technologies, has become geopolitically fraught. So the US and China are competing. The US political establishment's getting more hawkish on China. They're competing to dominate these energy supply chains, these technology supply chains. There's so much to talk about there, but the point that I want to make sure we understand is that this is leading to an historically unusual situation where powerful global North countries like the US, like the European Union states and the European Union as a whole, Canada, et cetera, are actually wanting more mining in their borders. So instead of the old or predominant system since colonialism of you do all that stuff elsewhere because it's toxic, it's low value added, it's not very, it's kind of like something that you can just import and then you make the higher value added stuff. That's changing. And what we're seeing is a lot more mining projects in the global North in order for global North governments to have a sense of, quote, supply chain security from lithium mining all the way to battery manufacturing. So that's a change, and it's important, but it doesn't mean we don't have mining in the global South. It just means we have more mining everywhere, including in the global North. This kind of whole juncture is creating some interesting risks and opportunities for the global South, which I'll kind of skip for now because we can talk about that more in the Q&A maybe. But I think it's clear that it doesn't necessarily mean that if the global North is doing more mining internally, that then the global South automatically gets to go up the chain of development or the kind of value-added, supply chain. Like there's still mining in the global South, and the issues around the difficulty of doing more more kind of capital and tech intensive and complex forms of production remain, right? So it's very possible that the global South will be a massive extractive zone and low wage labor zone for this new energy economy, right? But maybe the global North changing its approach to supply chains, and maybe the competition between the US and China for the hearts, minds, and resources of the global South, like gives some opportunities in the positive sense. So we could talk about that. But for now, what we see is that extraction's expanding everywhere, and it's more intense in the global South, but we have these new extractive frontiers or growing extractive frontiers in the global North too. So we have this contradictory conjuncture where there's deepening unequal exchange, ecological and economic, and we have more mining in the global North. So on the left, we have a view of all these different mining projects, lithium particularly being proposed in the US Southwest. And then on the right, we just have a reminder, but also like an amazing investigation by The Guardian showing how many new oil and gas projects. So this is on the fossil capital side. As I said, they're both growing. The mining for the energy transition and fossil capital are both growing. And fossil capital is growing the most in the global North states. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's crazy, right? I mean, it makes me feel crazy when I look at these charts. So the majority of new oil and gas licenses in the five most affluent kind of oil and gas producers in the world. So that we see a lot of extraction everywhere, and it's all under the kind of banner of this energy security, and kind of these supply chain conflicts and wanting to have territorialized access to energy. So I'll try to wrap in about 5. Will David give me a thumbs up or someone give me a thumb? Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry. I know I'm going slightly over, but trust me, I skipped a lot, so it could have been worse. A big takeaway there's 2 takeaways I'd like you to have from this lecture, which is that 1, extractive capitalism or extractivism is very unequal, and it's very sedimented in colonial dynamics, but also by the same token, it's a terrain of struggle. It's not just like passive victims and perpetrators. Like there is an ongoing conflict, and there can be gains made in, again, these David and Goliath situations. So some interesting things that are happening. The global South is not just sitting back and letting the global North extract its resources for the energy transition. The global South is fighting back in various ways. That includes governments who are renewing resource nationalism. So we've had recent nationalizations or the establishment of new state-owned companies in relation to energy transition mining. So a lot of this is about lithium, but not exclusively. We also have some attempts at resource nationalism that try to address environmental concerns rather than just the kind of economic structures. So I can say more of that if you want. There are also policies, and this is across the global South. I have examples here: Indonesia, Zimbabwe, Chile, to name 3 prominent examples where governments are trying to move up the value-added supply chain, right? And not just export the nickel or lithium in this case, but to actually industrialize it. And there's some success happening. So that's interesting. We also see growing militancy at the front lines of all of this extraction, fossil fuels and energy transition related. And because some of this extraction is increasing in the global North, we see alliances, North and South, that are quite interesting, but also challenge some of the simplistic categories sometimes of like global South and North, like totally different from one another. Like there are actually movements, and a lot of this has to do with indigenous movements, sometimes themselves, that cross borders, right? Or don't identify with their national state in some ways, right? And so, but also environmentalist and peasant. We have a variety of movements that are kind of crossing the North-South divide as the extractive apparatus gobbles up more territory. We also see interesting tensions between capitalists and the state, including in the global North, around this attempt to onshore supply chains. Some corporations are happy with that, some are not. There's tensions between finance and extractive sectors. I know I'm going quickly here, but it's really to just give you a flavor that this is not a stable or static system. There's constant tension and contradiction that's only provisionally resolved, and there's always opportunities for struggle and transformation as well. Um, and so that's kind of the thought I want to leave you with. And I'm just going to name, I've kind of said this, so I'm going to move forward. I'm going to name a couple of interesting developments that I think open our eyes to what progressive and even more transformative changes might be that could really make a break from the colonial legacy, because that's what we're talking about when we talk about transformation. It's what will actually enter us into a new historic era that is not so shaped by the ugly, sordid, violent, unequal history of colonialism. And what that looks like is, we can start at the sites of extraction. That looks like localized struggles that defend rights, that demand rights, whether it's rights to Indigenous consent, rights of nature to be protected. We can also look at national governments that are progressive, that actually try to holistically govern land use, thinking about the impacts on water, on community, on habitat. We can think about better regulations of firms, but very importantly, also tax models and ownership models that involve the public sector more and reduce the volatility of these resource sectors, right? But not everything can happen at the local or national level. We need global change, right? This is progressive international. There's a reason that that's the lens of the entity Progressive International, because really we can only do so much at the national level while these architectures of trade and finance and political kind of constraint operate transnationally, right? So we look at the fact that the unsustainable levels of sovereign debt in the global south force countries to double down on extraction. And there's actual evidence, empirical evidence, it's not just a hypothesis, puts countries in the corner of extraction because the only way to repay your debt is just to keep mining or keep extracting the oil because it's a reliable revenue source, right? We have the disproportionate power of investors over this whole process. We have the fact that there needs to be global redistribution so countries get a little fiscal breathing room and can reorient to other economic activities, right? We have the fact that taxes are actually stolen from the global south at alarming rates via tax havens, so the companies don't even always pay their full share, right? And we also see that we can look at forms of regional integration. So that's kind of about changing the power structures, but also countries can coordinate among themselves to change their regional kind of economies. And there's always been a lot of talk about that in Latin America, and that talk is very salient right now. Like, can at least the progressive governments in Latin America regionally integrate their own supply chains so that they're oriented towards Latin American development and not towards the profits of multinational companies, right? But the last thing I want to leave you with, because it's very important to understand that from colonialism to the present, extraction is never just about what happens with extraction. It's about the broader system that extraction is oriented to serve. And that is about the production and consumption patterns that are entrenched in global capitalism, especially among affluent classes in the global north. So another way, and the final thing it's important to end with, to kind of reduce the pressure on landscapes, on habitats, on watersheds, on communities, but also reduce the pressure on global south governments to have to regulate this onslaught, is to actually change how we produce and consume in the global north in ways that would also benefit the global north. Is not about austerity for the global north. It would be better to use fewer cars and have more mass transit, but it would also require a lot less lithium. And that would mean a lot fewer lithium mines being needed for the energy transition, which would help the pressure on landscapes and also allow those global south countries to use the lithium for their own domestic purposes of development rather than for export, or to at least make the decision, do we want to mine or not? Just to kind of reduce how predatory and intense and rapacious extraction is, we can think about the kind of other end of the supply chain and changing how we, in this case, move around. This was a research project I was involved in that compared an energy transition where everyone owns a Tesla versus one in which we use e-bikes and e-buses and walk around. And it's a dramatic difference in how much lithium is used. So we can change. Maybe we can't eliminate extraction. I'm coming full circle with the beginning of my talk, but we can dismantle extractivism, and we can radically change how much material footprint we meaning especially the affluent globally, we kind of use on the Earth's surface. And so I think that nothing is set in stone about resource use. It's all thoroughly political, social, and economic. So I will leave it there, and I'm will maybe leave the slides just for a second, but I can also stop sharing my screen, whatever is useful. You tell me, David.
Yeah, I think maybe leave your slides on there, and I can just talk from this Zoom abyss um, to relay some of the questions. And there aren't too many, so or maybe people will continue to add those questions to the group chat, and I'll relay them. There's a couple questions that focus really specifically on one area that you may or may not have things to say, which is about deep sea mining. And I think that there's two questions there. One is about the kind of ecological questions of deep sea mining. If you have anything to say about that, but I think the more interesting question being posed there is about what are you seeing in terms of territorial questions that obviously so much of your talk has to do with the geography of extraction. And, I think maybe the case of the Essequibo is instructive here, but maybe you could say a bit more about how you see kind of borderland disputes over extraction becoming either more or less salient. So I thought we could start with those kind of questions together about
Yeah.
about the oceans and about territorial conflicts when it comes to the political economy of extraction.
Yeah. So this is a great question, and I get it a lot. And it's interesting. I think that it captures people's imagination because I think it sounds a little sci-fi, and so it's kind of interesting, but also it has the flavor, and it should have this flavor of like a new frontier, right? And so it kind of it I think attracts our attention to the fact that capitalism and extractive capitalism is always like searching for the next frontier, right? And that frontier can be extraterrestrial in kind of two meanings of that word, right? Like one can be like oceans instead of terrestrial mining or land mining, mining the ocean, and there are different ways to mine the ocean. The other could be what we think of when we think of extraterrestrial, which is like outer space, right? And there have been like lots of discussions over years of like, oh, could we get these elements from asteroids, from these types of things? And so I think just first and foremost, the kind of territorially expansive nature of extractive capitalism is particularly salient and visible when we get into these kind of weird zones of extraction that even go beyond the kind of typical land-based mining. So I think it shows us the expansive geography of extraction is the first thing I would say. As I said, there are a lot of minerals in the ocean and they can take different forms. I'll just note one, which is not what is generally meant by deep sea mining, but it's an important one to know about, is that lithium, which I've mentioned a few times, exists in the ocean's waters, in the water itself at low concentrations. But we could get to a point where that becomes an important deposit, as, if humanity is like using a lot of the land-based lithium, right? And so that's one way we can have ions, of something like lithium, in the Earth's oceans. But what deep sea mining generally refers to, and where the ecological impacts become very concerning, are mining the ocean bed floor, right? And I'm not an oceanographer, and probably neither are the people that ask this question, but I think that it's clear that if you are literally like upending and digging into and removing nodules that are on the floor of the ocean, you are disrupting a habitat that we actually know very little about, right? It's still like the cutting edge of like oceanography science to really like understand the habitats that exist at these tremendous depths of the Earth's oceans, right? And so mining them destroys them potentially, or disturbs them at least, before we even fully understand how they operate. And then so there's a lot of environmental concerns. I would be very skeptical of what the deep sea mining companies say when they're like, this is better than earth-based, than terrestrial mining. They're both bad in different ways. And the question is to really have the objective science, which we so often lack, to really compare the harms, right? And then the third thing, and this goes to the edges of my knowledge, but there's a ton of interesting stuff to read, even in the mainstream media coverage, even the New York Times, we'll just say, had like a really good series on it. There is very concerning stuff happening at the UN body that regulates deep sea mining. And we've seen like the most classic, almost like comic book villain types of regulatory capture, where one of the main companies that engages in deep sea mining, that has a lot of the seabed rights, is also like very involved, much too intimately, with the regulating body, right? And so we see that regulatory capture.
Hey, I'm out there.
And then lastly, just to the last part of the question, like we are seeing really concerning things where global South countries that and island nations that have like strategic positions vis-a-vis the ocean bed and the rights to kind of the maritime rights around that are being like pressured, coerced, or maybe even their domestic political class like wants this, but it's very concerning to kind of sell those rights to the highest bidder, right? So again, we're seeing this kind of reproduction of these unequal extractive relationships in the most kind of vanguard frontier of extractive capitalism.
One more question. I think a lot of people are thinking about the last slides you had, Thea, which are really about, you call them alternative futures, but thinking about the inequalities, inequities you've traced in the presentation, be it kind of core periphery or the consumption inequalities that you showed in those graphs from Jason and others about people living beyond their means. I guess it sounds like people in the chat are curious to speak a bit more from that more either prescriptive or even to utopian perspective about how we might go about redressing those inequalities. I mean, one very popular approach is to think about degrowth, which has become, I think, caricatured frequently, but really is supposed to be redressing some of those inequities in its way. And then others are asking, how can we think about building a world system that doesn't rely on core periphery distinctions? So maybe you could just spend a couple more minutes telling us from that more, you might even say NIEO angle, like what does this look like in if you close your eyes and imagine a global extractive regime that is not either bound to this colonial architecture, but also, is more ecologically responsible in some way. Do you see a future there? And if so, what might it look like? Leaving aside the questions of how we get there, which I think are obviously, the most important, but just what does it look like to you when you think about, where we might be in 20 years, of course, living through the worst aspect of the climate crisis, but something that could give us some vision towards which to aspire.
So I think that when we try to think of what would a transformed regime of extraction look like that is no longer extractivist, even if we are using materials, we're using them in a fundamentally different way with a fundamentally different distributive paradigm, meaning it's not that a small percent of the world hoards most of the resources, right? And towards ends that serve human needs, serve the needs of nature, of the planet, rather than the needs of capital or the 1%, right? And when we kind of try to envision that, I think it's useful to remember that there are multiple distinct but intersecting pathologies of extraction. The reason I say it is because when we want to understand what would be better, we have to understand what's wrong and understand that like the different facets of what's wrong kind of need sometimes distinct attention. And just to simplify, we have economic, ecological, and political and social problems with extraction, right? It's environmentally harmful, it's socially and economically unequal, it requires and reproduces forms of political domination, both of the global north over the global south, but also within the global south of like the affluent or politically connected classes over the rest of their societies, right? And so we have this kind of fractal system in which at every scale, global, national, local, we have intersecting harms, forms of domination, inequalities, impacts, etc., right? So how do we address all of that, right? There are sometimes approaches that I think address an important piece of that, but don't address the rest, and sometimes can even exacerbate the other problems, right? So, if we only take a resource nationalist lens, as important as I think resource nationalism is as a vision, as an ambition for the global South to own its own resources, right? But if you do that without accounting for the ecological impacts, you can have cases of extractivism under state ownership, but with harms that are not that dissimilar from when it's under more corporate ownership, right? Or alternatively, if you just look at ecology or you just have an oppositional stance without a positive program, and you just say we need to stop extraction, you don't, I mean, while that might be necessary in any given case, there are lots of mines I think should not be built. They're just obviously a bad idea on safety grounds, on water use grounds, whatever it is. The community doesn't want them, right? I believe in self-determination, right? So like, sure, there are many mines that shouldn't be built, but if the only response to mining is no, then how do those global South governments pay the bills? How do they invest in social services? So that's like unsatisfying. And I think what's also unsatisfying about both of those responses is that it leaves out the global picture, meaning it's not just about global South governments doing better, like regulating mining better or like owning the resources better or whatever it is. It's also about the position that they are put in and changes that need to happen, not just at other scales. I'm not saying we need a UN general, resolution, though that's fine with me, but like in other places, meaning when we trace the whole supply chain from mining to final, like to industrialization to final consumption, we can change the other end of the supply chain and it reverberates back towards changing mining. And so, for me, just to put that all together, and I'm going to go back to my final slide, like what would bring the most global justice is if we could build a less resource intensive global economy that would reduce the environmental harm, reduce the inequality in resource use, right? Because if affluent people are just told you can't use as much resources, or the global South is going to develop its own resources, like that inequality in consumption and use is part of what maintains the kind of overall economic and political inequality, right? So if we can reduce the resource intensity, that just means like how much resources are used per capita, per output, whatever it is, then we can also reduce the inequality in resource use. We can reorient resource use towards human and social need in the global North and the global South, right? Because while it's worse for the global South, in the global North, resource use is also not driven by human need. It's driven by, what car corporations or energy corporations or whatever they are want to do, right? And so I think that despite the fact that there are sometimes tensions between the desires for economic autonomy and independence in the global South and the desires for like better ecological management, I think that these are actually less in tension with one another. That kind of resource nationalist and degrowth position are less in tension with one another if we reduce resource intensity overall, and we think about things like I mentioned, like regionally integrated supply chains that are governed by the needs of Latin American societies rather than by the needs of faraway corporations and consumers, right? And so I think a lot of these solutions can actually fit together, but there is sometimes some flexibility needed. And I say this as a leftist, obviously as a leftist, but also to my fellow comrades, that like just straight up resource nationalism without an ecological sensibility is not adequate in the 21st century. Degrowth that doesn't have an alternative for global South governments to pay the bills and to address the social debt in the global South is not viable, right? So while they both have important insights, the point is, how do we combine their most valuable insights into a more kind of, I think, holistic and intersectional analysis of how we can finally, I hope, dismantle extractivism and cut those ties with the legacy of the colonial order.
And just by way of closing, with tremendous gratitude to you, Professor Riofrancos, I think if we might move from the prescriptive side, which I think you've laid out very eloquently, in terms of not just what must be done, but what can be done. Let's move back to the predictive.
Yeah.
What do the next years kind of look like for you? And maybe we can close by toggling back from sort of what do you think is likely to happen in the next 5 years, perhaps looking at places like COP30, looking at kind of these present trajectories of extraction, just into the immediate future, and then what does that tell us in terms of activists, advocates, intellectuals, all the people enrolled in this course who have a real stake and a real commitment to participating in a more in the struggle for a more equitable global extractive regime.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And I'm just bringing us back to this slide because I think this is our near-term future as much as it pains me to say it, which is one in which fossil capital continues to expand with the license, figurative and literal, of global North governments. and at the same time, extractive frontiers for the energy transition multiply. And so we're in a moment of just completely unsustainable. I wish there was a better word because that almost feels like it downplays it. Completely unsustainable pressure on planetary systems and the communities that depend and rely on those planetary systems, which is all of us, but some communities are, if they're near an extractive sites, are obviously more directly affected. So we're going to see an all of the above energy strategy. What that means is more oil, more gas, a little less coal globally, so that's good, but also more lithium, more nickel, more copper, right? And I don't right now, given how much the great powers of the world are like fully behind this like so-called natural gas, we should call it fossil gas, expansion for geopolitical reasons, right? To like offset Russia's power, right? This whole matrix just means more and more extraction of all the things so that we get like national energy security, both for the energy transition and for the current fossil fuel-based energy system. And that is very concerning. So I think, first of all, activists, and I include myself, and advocates need to keep their gaze very broad. Like, let's not, on the one hand, if we start to focus on energy transition mining, as I do, forget about the fact that there's enormous volumes of fossil fuel mining and fossil fuel extraction, or vice versa. If we are mainly a climate advocate and a carbon hawk, like not forget that the technologies we're promoting, unless we change those patterns of production and consumption, are also opening up new extractive frontiers. Like what I'd really like, and maybe this is Pollyanna-ish, is for anti-mining advocates and climate advocates to actually work more together rather than be divided in a typical divide and conquer strategy where like the climate peoples are like mad about, people protesting lithium mines, and the lithium mine protesters are mad that the climate people don't focus on that and just focus on fossil fuels. Like, if we can bring this together, then we have a holistic understanding of extraction as the cause, as the UN puts it, of the triple planetary crisis, right? And so what I see is elites kind of sacrificing everything, land, ecosystems, humans, in this extractive rush to ensure territorial and political control over all energy supply chains. And what I don't see enough is like advocates that deal with these different issues, like joining hands and sharing a holistic analysis. I'm sure I'm culpable of that. I'm not trying to cast blame elsewhere, but I think the more we can see the whole system, the more we can devise strategies that don't sacrifice one extractive frontier for another or vice versa, right? That actually see these as interconnected and rooted in capitalism, but also, as David put it, in some of those systems of political domination that buttress global capitalism, right? Like those COP meetings that like activists are totally excluded from, or that happen in some of the most reactionary petro states, right? Like we need to address that and address the other forms of mining that are growing with the energy transition.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Thea, for this incredibly wide-ranging survey of extraction, of extractivism, of its implications for us all here in the grand family of broader community of the Progressive International. I think this has been like a very fundamental contribution to the course as we designed it in thinking about pretty much the most epicentral question of global capitalism, past, present, and future. So I'm really grateful to you, Thea. I'm really excited to see so many people here on this call and engaging so closely with such rich questions. We will be, of course, taking this recording and passing it on to the rest of the course, and we'll be in touch with Thea for those who have follow-up questions or seeking recommendations for readings. But for now, I wanted to thank you for sticking around for the extra time. And wish everyone a great morning or afternoon or evening. A special thanks to our interpreters for making it possible to speak across this language divide. You might even say a south-north or north-south divide. So thank you again, Thea, and a special gratitude to you. This is a terrific presentation. Perhaps, with your permission, I could even share the slides
Yep.
with the chat that we have going on Telegram. So yeah, I wanted to thank everyone and wish you well. And until next time, thanks, Thea.
Thank you so much, David, and to everyone else.
Bye, everyone.